All right. Hello and welcome everybody to Dispersing the Fog. This is episode 32 and it is October 19th, 2025. I'm Adam Rogers here with Paul Palango. How you doing, Paul?
I'm here again. I
Yeah.
made it.
You
Although I was
may-
cutting glass just now in my hands, I got a few little nicks here and there.
Oof.
And then I realized, oh my God, I gotta get over here. I can't keep working on glass all day.
Deep in thought, when you're making glass, is that a time where you're focused totally on what you're doing, or do your mind go off on other directions, thinking about news stories and what you're going to say and that kind of stuff?
Yeah, that's pretty well how it works. You cut glass, you think about other things, you're not paying attention, cut yourself,
Oh, good.
stuff it
Well,
up, clean up the blood, and continue on thinking, cutting glass, cut yourself.
I didn't cut myself today. I was down to Sydney this morning for the Fiddlers Run. I've never done this event before. I did the half marathon, which basically you run from downtown Sydney around the harbor to North Sydney and back. And you're running out of Sydney and you think, "Oh, this is very pleasant," and not realizing when you turn the corner, the wind is completely in your face. So coming into the harbor, so
All
uh,
this running is
fun.
really making me tired.
Well, thanks. That was the last major run of the year, so that'll get me through hockey season. Gentlemen's hockey starts tomorrow night, so be ready for that. Paul, we've got some interesting stuff to talk about today. Really great guests lined up. Curt Petrovich, people will know from many years of reporting for CBC News. Curt Petrovich, CBC News, wherever. He could have been anywhere in the world for about 30 years. I think he was with CBC and based out of British Columbia then, I think, and now certainly. And he has a book out on the death of Dziekanski, Robert Dziekanski, at the Vancouver Airport. One of the great tragedies that
There's
needs
the
to be
book.
blamed and broken. I looks great. Like I've been reading his blog, I've been reading up on this. So we'll do a proper introduction in a little bit when we bring in Curt, but I think people are going to be really interested in this story. There's a lot of variables to this that I don't think the public generally knows, and it's kind of outrageous. There's a number of things that I think people are going to find, yeah, really, really out there.
Well, it's the story that we've been working on for years. The official narrative of what happened is not quite what happened.
Yeah,
And and some people were thrown under the bus uh, to make the official narrative work. Yeah, we've heard this story before, and that's what's attracted me to it and getting Curt in here.
it's great. Like just you know, the official inquiry blames the four officers for tasing him and killing him. Uh, they don't get charged for that. They do get charged with perjury. Two of the four get convicted. Two of those four sue the RCMP then for defamation, and one of them at least gets a settlement. So there's a lot going on there, a lot to unpack. So look
And
forward to
we'll get
that.
into why it's going to become current again. So we're a
Yeah,
little ahead of the world on this, and that's why we brought Curt in to get people up to speed for what's going to happen in a couple of weeks.
really glad that he's joining us, and we'll talk more about this, like I say. But encourage people to check out his website, and he's got a blog that he updates there as well. So along with the book. Okay, I got there's we're going to get to some political stuff here shortly, Paul. But uh, we can't go too far without wondering what happened to our Jays. We, we got a big game tonight. This will be after, well, actually halfway through the broadcast. The Jays Mariners game 6 will be starting. Trey Savage is going for the Jays. What are you thinking for tonight?
Well, I don't think any of these teams, including the Jays, have the pitching it's going to take to win. Neither Seattle or the Jays, and they're playing the Dodgers. And you saw the greatest performance ever
Wasn't that
by a
something?
player in Shohei Ohtani the other night. Strikeout 10, hit 3 home runs. Never happened before. And I think the Dodgers are just they spent a lot of money, but they've a lot of people spend a lot of money, but their players are it's a well-balanced team and they have overwhelming pitching.
It's amazing. It's like an 18-year-old going to play against little leaguers, the way he played that game the other night. Just something to behold. Well, we'll see. Always more baseball is always good, so it'd be interesting to see. But yeah, it doesn't look good for anybody going against the Dodgers. Okay, all right, we're gonna get into some political stuff but in a minute. But first, Paul, an update this week on the Jack and Lily Sullivan disappearance here in Nova Scotia. Two children went missing May 2nd, reported missing. Sorry. Might be a relevant distinction now. Reported missing May 2nd. And hadn't heard much of anything, wasn't getting a lot from the police, from the, information to the public. This week, thanks to the media, CBC and others fought to have. So when the police are looking for search warrants, they submit documents to the court saying, here's everything we know about the situation. Give us a search warrant on phones, on locations, properties, whatever. But often information in those will be redacted, blacked out so that the public can't see it. Media organizations often, or defendants, will apply to have those redactions removed so that people can see. This week, there were redactions removed thanks to the media intervention. And we learn that two witnesses in the neighborhood heard vehicles late at night in the area driving around the home where the two children were missing. Two independent witnesses. Well, they spoke to each other afterwards, but they spoke to the police, both with very similar recollections of the night before. And we're hearing this now, June, July, August, 5 months later. Paul, what do you think?
Well, you know, the RCMP and the way it investigates is problematic. I mean, they look for reasons not to investigate to make things go away. That's historically accurate. They're not aggressive. I got a note from a Mountie who we're going to be talking to in the near future, I hope, because his troubles with the Mounties is sort of come back into the forefront. His name is Dave Moore. But Dave Moore, when he was with the Mounties, was one of the people who helped set up the Amber Alert system in Nova Scotia. And what has happened? I got a note from Dave the other day talking about Jack and Lily Sullivan going missing. And he said this was a perfect example where an Amber Alert should have been put out immediately. That's how the system was designed. But the Dudley Do-Right in charge that day is allowed in the RCMP to make a decision not to put out an Amber Alert, and which sort of defies logic in this situation. And then before you know it, the case, everything has gone cold because no one was paying attention when they should have been paying attention and following the rules and the systems that were already in place. I mean, he's literally pulling his hair out, saying, "This is insane. They're not doing a good job, and they failed in this case, and now look what's happened."
Well, look, everybody's perception, watching the news, watching the interviews with the police, seeing the moves that they were making, like last couple of weeks, bringing in the cadaver dogs. Well, okay, everything must be pointing to those kids being in the area, lost in the woods somewhere. It's thick foliage and all that stuff. Okay, it's difficult. Done a lot of searches. Okay, sure. But this new information points to, well, okay, maybe there was a vehicle that abducted or there was something nefarious going on. We also find out that the mother of the two children says she went to sleep at 9 o'clock. The stepdad stayed up all night, was supposed to be cleaning. She wakes up in the morning, the house isn't clean, and the she doesn't know what he was doing. And now we find out from him, the CBC called this Daniel Martel to interview him, And he says, "Oh, the police didn't tell me that they interviewed two people who said there were noises around the area." Okay, well, if they're not telling him that, that tells me, Paul, that he's a suspect.
Yeah, for sure. Um, but somebody, the suspects obviously were the people closest to that house
Yeah.
in this situation. But let me get back to what Dave Moore said. I mean, I'd like to get
The
him on
Amber Alert.
camera in the next little while, but here's what he said, and I think this applies. He was a smart cop who got sort of railroaded out of the RCMP, and we're going to come back to this in a bit because he was involved in the Glen Assoon case with the missing documents and all kinds of malfeasance by the RCMP and Halifax police. Dave says the Amber Alert is designed to take the discretion away from egos and know-it-all police officers. The formula is simple. Send out the Amber Alert for the missing person as soon as it was reported to police. Why? Because time is of the essence, and the quicker people are alerted to the higher likelihood of somebody seeing and reporting them. The alert extends 100 kilometers for each hour they have been missing, plus an additional 100 kilometers radius. This is used as a general traveling speed by cars of 100 kilometers an hour. The rationale need not be explained. Just do it.
Yeah.
The Sullivan case in Nova Scotia was stymied by moron RCMP who thought they knew better. Who effing asked you to think for yourself? Now they are lost with no baseline of understanding and no scope of distance to the investigation. Even when a foolproof program is designed and implemented, the RCMP still can't get it right. Society loses every time. It's hard to fly like an eagle when you work with a bunch of turkeys.
And that's something. Well, let's just think of this simple little example. Okay, everybody's seen the articles with pictures of the two children. Okay, I haven't memorized those pictures. If there was an Amber Alert and somebody thought they were missing, you'd take a lot closer look at those photos just so that you're like, okay, well now I'm going to be on you never know where they might be, right? So that would generate potentially more leads by having the general citizenry more alert to it. So, big mistake there by the police.
Absolutely. But,
Okay.
it's not the first. I mean, it's probably, but Nova Scotia, the government of Nova Scotia wants the RCMP to be the major police force in Canada. When other provinces like Alberta, Premier Daniel Smith came out this week and was asked about the RCMP, and she's talking about what a disaster it is in Alberta. As she quote, we pay for 1,911 officers to police Alberta, and at any time, 400 are off sick
Well,
all the
here's
time. It's things aren't getting done, and they're moving towards setting up their own provincial police force, which is going to have severe implications for the RCMP's contract policing in the rest of Canada.
Well, that's a good segue, Paul, because this week we had a major federal justice announcement, and one of the things announced, there were three things announced as part of this overall strategy. By the way, announced by Immigration Minister Lena Metlich-Diab in Halifax, not the Minister of Immigration, not by Sean Fraser, the Minister of Justice, who one might have thought would be announcing such things. So that was curious in itself. Announced it at the Halifax Regional Police headquarters. But a $1.8 billion included for additional RCMP police hiring, federal policing capacity. So 1,000 new RCMP officers are expected to result from this new announcement.
Well, the 1.8 million is broken up over 4 years
Yeah.
and going to largely to increase the stipend received by cadets when they attend depot in Regina. So they'll get $1,000 a week. But where are these people going to come from? They no police force can bring people in nowadays. It's well, some can, but it's very difficult for the RCMP because of the structure of the force. And then this exacerbates the problem. Depot is set up to basically provide policing for contract policing, which is essentially municipal policing or provincial policing, how to pull a car over in a traffic stop, that kind of stuff. Simple investigations, not complex federal investigations. So the force's structure and its whole attitude is screwed up, but the federal government keeps throwing money at them. They're at like $6.2 billion now. They're like Premier Smith says in Alberta, 20 to 25% are off sick on any given day. Everyone's paying full freight for these guys, whether they think so or not, and they're not doing the job. Something has to be done.
One of the other aspects of this, and this is going to come up through and this will be part of this will be debated at Parliament, is new bail provisions. Reverse onus bail provisions for more serious crimes, basically to say, well, instead of the Crown proving why you should be held, you're going to have to prove why you should be released. And, there's all this debate about these bail provisions, Paul, and I could tell you, as somebody that practices criminal law, those are they're such irrelevant changes. Like the practical thing is, if you have somebody charged with a serious drug or crime or violence crime, it's going to be tough to get bail. You're going to the onus, whether it's on the defense or on the Crown, the onus is really on the defense to come up with a plausible plan. And it's not easy to get bail, especially in those circumstances. Most of the time, if these violent offenders are getting bail, it's because the case against them is very weak. And so the Crown doesn't feel justified in holding them on that basis. We'll see. It's kind of they're going to get hotly debated, but they're kind of meaningless. The more, I guess, maybe hot political item is the comments from Pierre Polyev about the RCMP. And I think you were already commenting on this publicly, Paul. What did you think of those ones?
Well, Pierre Polyev came out with a statement about the RCMP, its corrupted nature, how it let the liberals off in the SNC Lavalin scandal, and it favors the liberals. It's politicized. He went on and on and on. And yeah, I got called up by Alex Pearson, the talk show host in Toronto, and said, this is Pierre Polyev saying the RCMP, this, that, and the other thing. And I just laughed. And she says, well, what do you think? He says, why are you laughing? I said, well, has Pierre Polyev got a plan to fix the RCMP, to depoliticize the RCMP, to sort of rescind the move made in 1984 that the commissioner of the RCMP becomes a deputy minister in the Solicitor General's office, now Public Safety, which means he's there to advise the government and serve at the pleasure of the prime minister. So, as I've said before, like the better banana republics, the police are corrupted in Canada automatically. So, Mr. Polyev, do you have a plan to disconnect the RCMP from the political process and put them back where they belong in the justice system, where they are independent of politics and they go about their jobs in the public interest in the name of the law? I don't think Mr. Poilievre's going to do that. As I pointed out, Stephen Harper, when he ran for prime minister, 20 years ago, said the same thing. I'm going to do this. I'm going to do that to the RCMP. I'm going to get them out of contract policing. And when he got into power, nada. I sort of like it this way. I have control of them.
Like it kind of baffles me too that, you know, part of his problem with the last election was that people thought he was a little too much like Trump and adopting a little too much of the MAGA approach to politics. And here he is undermining the rule of law, people's appreciation or respect for the rule of law by suggesting these things without really back. I mean, listen, SNC Lavalin, there were definitely problems there. There could have been criminal charges. That was debatable. The Aga Khan visit, yes, an ethics violation. Was it criminal? Well, geez, I don't like it. Didn't seem like it was there, but so there's debates there. But Polyev makes these statements, but he doesn't back them up in any specific way.
Well,
So
it's
it's really,
well, it's basically what's the phrase? Rage farming.
yeah,
He's out there rage farming, getting all his locals. Yeah, get the liberals, do this, do that. But he doesn't provide any alternatives or doesn't say, yeah, this, my party has benefited from this, and my friends have benefited from this politicization of the police in the past. This is not right in a democracy. Everyone should be treated equally under the law. Therefore, let's disconnect the police from the political process. Let's do something really brave and different. That would be good policy.
Yeah, and potentially good politics too. I think it would be. So, um, all right, uh, Paul. Let's. What do you think? Should we bring in Curt?
Yeah, I think yeah, let's bring in Curt right now.
Yeah. All right. Let's go. He's in the waiting area here on the our Zoom call. All right. Wow, he's at the top of a mountain somewhere, according to his picture. I'm jealous.
Hi there.
Hey, how are you doing? You're sideways.
Oh, am I sideways? You want me that way?
Oh, that's better. Yeah. It was like a
Okay.
circus. It was like a circus trick you were doing there.
Okay.
Yeah,
So this is vertical as opposed to
Yeah, you're
horizontal.
fine. You look
yeah,
good.
great
Okay.
there. All right. Hello. All right, everybody. This is Curt Petrovich, CBC News. Everybody will know who you are, Curt.
Well, I need to correct you. Ex-CBC News. I
Ex-CBC, yes, of
retired
course.
from CBC 2 years ago.
No, I know. I'm just thinking anybody that's watched the news in Canada over the last few decades is going to know who you are and recognize the voice. I don't know if they recognize the beard or not, but but no, great to have you on, Curt. We teased this a little bit at the beginning of the show here, talking a little bit about Dziekanski and your book and such, and really eager to get into this. I think people are going to be pretty well outraged, but really interested in what you have to say and what you've been covering.
I'll do my best.
Well, and one of the things, Curt, that that our focus is has largely been on official narratives that aren't what they seem. And yours, when I look at your book, here it is again, and we showed it earlier, Blamed and Broken, the Mounties and the death of Robert Dziekanski. You took on a story that sort of challenged the official narrative. And tell us how you got there.
Well, I mean, I was assigned to cover the event on that Sunday in October of 2007. Just like any other day, well, not an unusual day to get called in on a day off when something happens like that. And we had this initial report that the RCMP told us that a man had been tasered in YVR in the international arrivals area in the middle of the night and had, as a result, died. And of course, we all trudged off to the airport and listened to the man at the time who was the chief of communications for the RCMP, Sergeant Pierre Lemaitre. And he told us the story of what happened. Man was creating a disturbance. People had called for the police. They had showed up. He was erratic. He threw stuff around, they said. And as a result, they used the taser a number of times, and he died shortly thereafter. I just expected at the time that it would be just one of those unfortunate, terrible stories that would fade into the background as something else took its place. But instead, what happened was that, well, it's rather complicated, and that's why I wrote the book to try to explain it. Um, but the RCMP, you have to remember at that time, if it ever hasn't been, was under a great deal of scrutiny for some cases in which alleged excessive use of force had been applied and people had died. And so the Dziekanski story was one that just sort of came along and it captured people's attention, in large part because the media at the time um, latched on to this narrative that the RCMP were covering something up. Um, you also have to remember that the taser was at that time, we're talking 18 years ago, was somewhat controversial because it was a brand new device, a tool, they called it. It was a weapon, a less lethal weapon, but nonetheless a weapon that could cause serious injury or death. That was always the case. But it had arrived on RCMP constables' hips, and it was very controversial at the time. So that, combined with the fact that this happened in such a spectacular fashion, and one person who happened to have a digital camera at the time managed to record a great deal of it in fairly high resolution imagery. You also have to remember in 2007, the iPhone had only just been introduced in the United States. It wasn't available in Canada. So at that time, digital photography on little flip phones was ridiculous. It was pixelated. You couldn't make out anything. But this man had a digital still camera that took movies, videos, and he captured as much of it as he could. And that video, which has played ad nauseum since the event itself, became for some people, proof that the RCMP had overreacted, had used excessive force. And for others, it became evidence that, in fact, Robert Dziekanski had been behaving erratically. He was non-compliant when the RCMP showed up. But, it was a matter of how people decided to view and frame that video, which became famous around the world because of what it appeared to show.
Well, it appeared to show that what people latched onto was he had a stapler in his hand, and therefore he wasn't dangerous, and that the RCMP overreacted. Instead of trying to take the stapler off him, they ended up killing him.
Yeah, that's the sort of narrative, and of course, the idea of four heavily kitted out officers, young men for the most part, facing off against a 40-year-old, overweight, sweaty guy who's holding a stapler in his hand. Come on, did you really need to kill him? That's the narrative. Unfortunately, that narrative is largely fictional because it leaves out a lot of details that only came to be known during a subsequent inquiry into what happened. And even though it became absolutely clear that when those four officers walked into the international arrivals area of Vancouver International Airport, that they had not expected that any of this was going to happen. They had a taser. None of them had ever used it before. But in training, they had been told explicitly, look, this is the thing you use when you're trying to get control of somebody because it will do less damage and harm and injury to that individual than it would be as if you all just sort of tackled him. And so they went into it fresh from their training thinking, okay, this guy's not cooperating. He's showing a stapler. He's showing that he's intending to be combative and resist. Just use the taser, bring him down. The problem was it was a whole series of things that occurred. The problem was the officer who fired the taser expected him to go down immediately. And of course, we found out subsequently that when the taser probes were fired, they kind of got caught in Robert Dziekanski's shirt. So he didn't get the full effect. It was obviously disturbing and painful to him, but it didn't bring him down. So as he was going to the ground, all in the space of about a second or two, the officer fired again. And this time it did connect with him. But Robert Dziekanski was still combative. He was still fighting off the four officers. And so they fired again. And then at one point, the taser was used in what's called push to stun mode. So it was placed on his, I can't remember at the moment, but it was placed on his body and another shock was delivered. Finally, they were able to get his hands out so that they could handcuff him. But all of this happens within a matter of seconds. I know people watch the video and they go, well, why couldn't you do this? And why couldn't you do that? And why didn't they do this? What I've always said since that event is that everybody who watches the video of Robert Dziekanski, in which he dies, everybody who watches that video has something that those four officers did not have at that time. And that was, how was this going to end? Everybody who watches that video knows that Robert Dziekanski died. Those four officers had no expectation that Robert Dziekanski would die. They thought they would just subdue him, charge him with some misdemeanor, and everybody would go on their way. And of course, that's not what happened.
Curt, that kind of leads to, like, there's so many weird parts of this. None of the four officers were charged with assault or with the actual killing of Dziekanski. They were all charged with perjury, which would seem to require all four of them to come up with a story together. Only two of them were convicted, not the two white guys. One of those two, Constable Millington, has received a settlement from the RCMP, and part of his claim was just what you talked about. Well, this is how we were taught to use the tasers, so why is the RCMP defaming us and telling the world that it's our fault and we did all this wrong? And the rumor is that it's $1 million settlement. Like, there's a lot going on. There's a lot going on here.
There is, and I covered it from day one, and was along as it developed into the thing that it was about the RCMP's covering up. Look, the RCMP did a whole bunch of things that did not help. They were defensive about it. Sergeant Pierre Lemaitre, who was the communications officer, he made some errors in his initial reporting of how many times the taser was used and so on and so forth. It's absolutely clear that those were honest mistakes. And in any event, they were not substantive mistakes. It didn't mislead people. I mean, these four officers were in an area that they believed was completely covered by surveillance video. They knew that somebody had videoed the whole thing because those four officers found the individual in the airport with the video, seized the video, and they confiscated, they took possession of it. And as one RCMP officer told me at one point when we were long into this process, he said, look, if the RCMP had wanted to make this video disappear, they could have done it. They didn't. Because at the time, nobody believed that what those four officers had done amounted to anything other than a tragic, unintentional series of events that coincided completely with how they were trained to deal with the situation at that time. So I got involved in this because I followed it all the way through the process, through the public inquiry that was called, and then ultimately the criminal trials, because at the end of this public inquiry, which, as I'm sure you know, inquiries cannot find essentially guilt. Nonetheless, the retired judge who ran that inquiry, made it absolutely clear that he thought these four officers were liars, self-serving, et cetera, et cetera. He paved the way for a special prosecutor to look at all the testimony from that inquiry and come to a conclusion that the officers must have lied. But here's what most people don't understand when they hear, oh, well, the officers were charged with perjury. What they were charged with perjury for was not lying about any details of what happened. They didn't get together and lie about what happened. The perjury charges, and this is a bit hard to understand, but the perjury charges related to their explanations for why their initial statements about what happened differ from what you see on the video, allegedly. And as I argue in the book, they actually don't differ all that much. And I go through all of their statements and I show how some of it agreed, some of it didn't. All four of them told slightly different stories. These are not four guys who got together and said, okay, let's get our stories straight. By no means. But the perjury charges allege that the only explanation for why all four of them gave slightly different stories than what you can see on the video is that they must have lied. And that was a pretty difficult case to make if you're going up before a judge. Another interesting aspect to the perjury trials is that the special prosecutor elected to go for 4 separate trials, not try them all as a group, as you might if you were claiming that this was some sort of grand conspiracy. They chose to go after each individual officer on the merits of the arguments about exactly what they say they must have lied about. But in
That's
doing so,
insane. That's insane right off the bat. Like
well,
the four of them are together.
Yeah, what a waste of
But
resources
it
for
seems
among other things.
that it was designed to basically at least get a conviction somewhere. Take 4 shots at it.
well, I mean, I mean, I asked the prosecutor at that point, why are you doing this? It looks like you're trying to get as many kicks at the can as you possibly can. And they said, oh, no, 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 no. The reason we've gone for 4 separate trials is we're worried about constitutional arguments. And if if we're all put all our eggs in one basket, that could seriously delay the progress of our criminal prosecutions, et cetera, et cetera. But look, the outcomes of these trials, I think, indicate, what they were hoping for, which was a conviction. And when I sat through these trials and I saw the bizarre legal result, it's the only way you can describe it. You have essentially 4 officers who were all together, who were involved in this incident, and the prosecution argues that they all got together at some point and all agreed on a story. Never mind that their stories were all different. They're the worst conspirators I've ever heard of because they didn't even get their story straight. But let's put that aside. They weren't able to establish, the prosecution was never able to establish when and how they did this event because all of their time was accounted for. They were never all alone together as four individuals. They were it never happened, so they couldn't have done it that way. And then they latched onto this idea because somebody came forward and who happened to be the wife of the cousin of one of the officers, who claimed that all 4 of them got together at her house before the inquiry began to get their story straight. And when the prosecutor found out about this, that became the focus of their prosecution. Aha, we have a witness who saw all 4 of you together at her kitchen table. She wasn't there and didn't know exactly what you were talking about, but come on, you guys all met together. And interestingly enough, during the inquiry, they were all asked the simple question, did any of you meet all together before appearing at this inquiry? And they all said no. Well, if this witness is to be believed, then that is perjury, and that's enough to get a conviction. Has nothing to do with anything that happened on the night that Robert Dziekanski died, but the fact that they met together and had said they didn't, that's enough for a conviction, a perjury conviction.
Did they meet or not?
No. The problem is, and please read it in the book. I mean, it's truly absurd. This woman who came forward said that it happened on a certain weekend prior to the inquiry beginning. In fact, they didn't get together until the inquiry was over. She was off by months. But however, even though that was made clear in terms of the evidence at the prosecutions, defense lawyers showed bank transactions from one individual who was in Toronto at the time this meeting was supposed to have occurred in Vancouver. Another one wasn't in the Lower Mainland. They went through flight records. At one point, the prosecutor even tried to suggest, well, you could have flown in the jump seat of a passenger jet, and therefore your name wouldn't be on the passenger manifest, and like
Wow.
just crazy, crazy stuff.
Wow.
But
Grasping at
e-
straws. Yeah.
even at the end of it, when the prosecution was forced to admit that this was a complete red herring, a dead end, didn't happen, the most that they would do is say, well, it doesn't mean that it didn't happen. We just haven't found the evidence for it. Um, and the bizarre thing is, as these things happen, the judges, when dealing with this particular crazy evidence, which you would think would have tainted the prosecution, but it doesn't. You would think the judges might say, well, this was clearly false. Of course, none of the judges said it was clearly false. They just, they do what judges do, and they say, I choose not to accept or consider that evidence without casting aspersions on the witness who gave it 4 times at 4 separate trials. I sat through all of this, and then to hear the verdicts in these trials, which was, as I say, it only makes sense inside of a courtroom. So you have 2 of the 4 officers acquitted of any notion that they perjured themselves at the inquiry about meeting together, or any of their explanations for how they got things wrong. And then you had 2 officers who were found guilty. But aside from the fact that the 2 guilty parties, one of them is Indigenous and one of them is Black, um, make of that what you will. Um, and we can talk about that if you like. But the truly bizarre part is the judges who convicted those 2, in order to make a decision of a conviction, they had to accept that the 2 officers who were acquitted were in fact part of a conspiracy. So you have 2 officers who were acquitted, but in the judgments by those judges who found to convict the 2, they're guilty. And I don't know how you would. I don't know how I would feel if I went to trial and I was acquitted of a crime, but another judge, in convicting someone else, said I was guilty.
Yeah.
How does that make any sense? It
It
doesn't.
it doesn't, Kurt, and that's why, I mean, that's one of the reasons why, whenever there's arguments over whether there should be separate trials, or people tried at the same time, that's one of the things you think about. One of the main things you think about. Could there be inconsistent verdicts if we do it this other way? And if the answer is yes, you almost never would. So that's a very, that's very problematic. And then not having evidence, evidence is generally seen as something fairly important in a courtroom. So
The only evidence, though, this
just
is the
her.
thing. The evidence largely was this video. And so the judges who convicted said, well, I can see on the video what happened. The video is a record of what happened. I can hear what you said during the inquiry about why your statements to investigators at the time don't exactly line up with what I can see on the video. Certain things they said were out of order, for instance. And so on and so forth. And those judges essentially said, well, the test for me is whether or not it's likely that the only explanation for these discrepancies is that it was a deliberate attempt to mislead.
It's
Um,
it's so wrong though, Kurt. I mean, that's another sort of general principle for judges to follow is, if stories are perfectly consistent, that's almost always a lie. That's when people are lying. It's where people observe the same thing. They're going to have slightly different uh, views of it, perspectives, memories of it, and their stories are going to be slightly different, even though they're both trying to be honest. So
well,
that
all
that adds
there's
credibility to it.
Well, it was, 1, 2 in the morning. So there were a number of people who witnessed this. They were the ones calling for the police to show up. The man who shot the video, you can actually hear him on the video. He's shooting at the time, first of all, saying, "Thank God the police are here," because at this point, this is quite a disturbance. And then while he's struggling with him on the ground, while the police are struggling with Dziekanski on the ground, you hear this video taker. He says, "How is he still fighting them off?" He also says at one point, when the police show up, he says, "Now the good stuff," because he's shooting this thinking he's going to show this to his friends, home video, and whatever. It is only after it's clear that Dziekanski has died that everybody shifts. And everybody who thought that what the police were doing was what they should be doing in this situation, suddenly it's now they acted improperly. And the interviews with the eyewitnesses, everybody had a slightly different version of what happened. I mean, heck, the first officer to greet Mr. Dziekanski was Bill Bentley. He walks up to him, and you can hear him on the video, and he says, "How's it going, bud? How are you, sir?" And then things sort of deteriorated from there. But in Bill's statement, to homicide investigators, not an hour or two later, he's asked point blank, who was the first officer to engage with Mr. Dziekanski? And Bill says words to the effect of, "I don't know. I can't remember. It wasn't me." But of course it was. Now, why would you lie about something like that? I mean, he engaged with him and said, "Hi, how's it going? How you doing?" Like, he was friendly. He was non-threatening. He was trying to de-escalate. But it's an example of, obviously, I think, of veracity. Like, these officers did not expect this to happen, and it all happened inside of 30 seconds from the time they arrived and said, "How's it going, bud?" to the time that Dziekanski, that first taser pull. It's 26 seconds. So they weren't expecting this to happen, and they weren't making a mental note. The human mind is not a video recorder. But in any event, the video doesn't show any conspiracy. It shows four officers who were trained to use a device, believing it would function in a certain way, and being totally stunned that it didn't, and then totally stunned that Dziekanski died. Now, I'm obviously glossing over a lot of details, but that's the end result. And if Robert Dziekanski had not died, we obviously wouldn't be talking about this. But I'm not sure that there would have been any change to how the RCMP uses tasers. I'm not an advocate for tasers. I think they were adopted by the RCMP without all of the necessary thought and testing and consideration. And certainly after all of this happened, there were changes to the way tasers were used, and that's an absolutely a good thing. But I think what ended up happening in this case is that the RCMP was under all kinds of scrutiny for all kinds of excessive use of force and death in custody cases. This one came along. The fact that it was on video and it was shown over and over and over again, I think, based on everything that I researched and found, I think the RCMP just said, "We gotta cut these guys loose." Like, these are, we're not going to stick our neck out for four guys, because there's much more at stake here.
Well, let's
And
before you get into that,
yeah,
let's explain to our audience why we're here. Why 18 years later we're talking about this, because there's something coming up. There was an OPP investigation that you can tell us about, Project Eastbourne, And I originally talked to one of the Mounties, Corporal Benjamin Monty Robinson, to try to get him to talk about this and what was coming up, I think on November 14th. And he said, after all the years I've spent doing this, Paul, I don't want to say anything right now. I want to see what they've said. Maybe you can background for us how the OPP investigation came about, some of the waypoints along the way for Robinson, who's pushed this tenaciously, and what's coming up. I mean, what do you think is coming up?
Well, Project Eastbourne is really the result of Monty Robinson um incessantly complaining about all aspects of how he was treated, how evidence was released. He made allegations that the RCMP withheld exculpatory, uh, potentially exculpatory evidence from his and the other criminal trials. He made complaints, and essentially he managed to reach an officer in the RCMP who had the ability to order an investigation. And that's in fact what he did, remarkably. And in doing so, the RCMP contracted with the Ontario Provincial Police, which had been involved before in doing various analyses of different aspects of the incident and how it had been handled. And they pulled together an investigative team several years ago, which is remarkable. And the targets of that investigation are senior members, and many now former senior members, because it's taken so long, of the RCMP, including the commissioner at the time. And so for the last several years, this investigative team has been, traveling back and forth across the country, interviewing everybody who had anything to do with how the RCMP internally dealt with this whole case of these four officers to try to determine whether or not there was, for instance, obstruction of justice in withholding evidence, things of that nature. Because certainly we do know, and I was able to document attitudes within the RCMP at senior ranks in which they just wanted these guys to go away. They wanted to bury this. They wanted it to go away, and certainly when the inquiry was over, the commissioner at the time um, immediately, without even having, as far as I can tell, without even having read the report, just adopted whole cloth what the inquiry commissioner had said about these four officers being, a stain on the RCMP and so on and so forth. And remarkable, given that when the incident happened, the commissioner actually personally called each officer and said, I'm behind you, I fully support you. But then, after a couple of years of nonstop RCMP that is covering it up, these four officers are all bad apples. They all got together and it's horrible. Um, Senior RCMP were, I think, looking forward to an end.
Well, the interesting thing too is Robinson was a corporal, so he was basically the team leader uh, from the Richmond detachment at the airport that night, right?
Right, right.
So he was the supervisor on call. He's the guy fighting the most, and my understanding is he's refused to settle like Kwesi Millington did
Yeah,
because he wants to get justice. He says, "I spent 2 years in jail. It wasn't right. They could have, this should have never happened, and I want my justice." And so he's just been absolutely militant about doing this. And
yep.
I've been, well, you're closer to it than I am, but I've been watching it for many, many years and in contact with him. And I think it's a remarkable development that he got the OPP to even put something on paper.
Absolutely. I wouldn't have expected, because look, I don't know what the budget is, but you can imagine a police investigation by the OPP that takes several years. There's travel all over the country. This has not been inexpensive. It's been a significant expense of money, human resources, time. Um, that being said, obviously the bar for finding that there is a likelihood, a substantial likelihood, that a crime was committed by senior members of the RCMP, i.e., obstruction, for instance, the bar is very, very high. Um, and, you know, they've been finished their investigation for some months now, long before the last election, for instance, in April. And my understanding is the report from the OPP investigative team is now in the hands of RCMP leadership. And in November, those investigators are going to travel to the BC Lower Mainland and meet with Monty Robinson, and the other officer who's out here. Um, and they're going to go over the report with them. And that's all we know for sure. My sense is if they were going to be recommending criminal charges against anybody who came under investigation in this case, I don't think they'd be doing that. I could be wrong, but and I think Monty is also prepared for the fact that the report's going to come back and not recommend charges. But then the question is, well, what did it find? Maybe certain things don't rise to the level of a criminal charge, but that doesn't mean that things didn't occur that still had an influence on the outcome of how it was perceived by the public. All of this, how the conduct of the criminal trials, was there material that could have been introduced but wasn't, and what was the reason why it wasn't? It's just hard to say. But the fact that this investigation was done at all, I think, is really significant. And I think, regardless, it's going to indicate, it already does in my mind, that something happened, something went wrong. And again, you know, not to toot my own horn, but when the investigation got underway, the lead inspector asked me if I would give a statement as part of their investigation. And I said, no, I can't do that for reasons related to sort of transparency, and I don't get involved in the prosecution or the investigation. I said, the book is a statement. The book is a collection of facts, and it's a narrative based on all of the true, provable things that occurred. And my understanding is that Blamed and Broken became sort of required reading for all the inspectors, investigators who were working on this case. I can tell you, for instance, that the book was banned during negotiations when people from the Department of Justice, the Federal Department of Justice, were sitting down and meeting with Bill Bentley and Kwesi Millington to work out settlements, because they all brought lawsuits against the federal government, the RCMP and the federal government. Each of the officers did. And Kwesi Millington, who wielded the taser that night, Bill Bentley, who was one of the most junior officers that night, they both brought lawsuits and negotiated settlements. And my understanding is that federal negotiators didn't allow the book into the room where they were doing the talking. So, and you know, I'll also point out that, you know, Blamed and Broken, and I didn't do it for this reason, but Blamed and Broken has a lot of very critical things to say about some very senior prosecutors judges in British Columbia, other lawyers, people who I think could probably sue me in their spare time. Um, and I didn't even get so much as an email from any of these individuals. And that's because the book is true. The things I wrote in the book are absolutely true. And so while some of it may be embarrassing, thought provoking about why did this happen? Why did these people do these things the way they did, and so on and so forth? They're true. And I think that's what makes this story so compelling, is that it was a confluence of a whole bunch of things that just went completely wrong. Um, the rush to judgment, the media as a whole picking up a narrative and just running with it.
Oh my
Um,
God, we're shocked with that here.
Yeah, we,
yeah,
we never see that.
We've sort of seen that here.
you see,
Curt,
I mean, I was part of it, in the sense that I was a journalist at the time and I was covering it like everybody else. But to this day, you can Google my name and CBC and Dziekanski, and you can see the stories that I wrote 15 years ago, 18 years ago, and they still stand up because I never wrote them as part of a narrative that said this is what happened. It was all from
No,
the
they're
point of
good.
view.
I've gone back and read them. They're great.
Thank
We're
you.
almost at the end here.
Okay.
Adam, you got one more
well,
question?
I was just gonna make the comment, Curt, that you're in good company here with Paul as somebody who's written a book about a significant inquiry generating situation, and that book has in large part driven the conversation about that. I mean, that's how you put something on the record and all of a sudden people need to react to it. I was gonna go back to the Braidwood inquiry, but we'll leave that for another time. I'm really interested in continuing this story. Like if we get into November and we hear about this report from the OPP, uh, like it's interesting. I think that Robinson probably did a big service. I mean, he probably could have, I'm sure he was offered a good settlement, the same as the others, and he continued on with this. And, he may get it both ways. He may get the outcome that he's looking for in terms of public exposure of the RCMP's, failings here, and also a settlement. So we'll see what comes of it.
Right. Yeah. Well, I mean, that, in settlements of this sort, they would have asked for a non-disclosure
Well,
agreement. They would have
yes.
said, so, and Monty Robinson, I don't see him, unless they're going to offer him a significant sum of money. I don't see him agreeing to never speaking about this again.
It's probably too late for that anyway.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No. And the question I have for you is a media question. Having been through the ringer, in my days at the Globe and Mail and whatever, one of the things I've observed in my career as I got into more controversial stuff, how easy it was for the tough guys in journalism that I was associated with, who I thought were tough, basically sort of turned their backs on me when I challenged official narratives. Did you find anything like that? The CBC and your experiences with the CBC, did they stand behind you or did they have things gone sour?
You know what? I have to say, initially, when the inquiry got going, I said we should be there every day. And they said, "Are you crazy? That's like 80 days." Like, no, we can't. We're not going to. There's not going to be enough news coming out of it to have a national reporter there every day. And I said, let's see how this goes. After a week, when they were getting several stories a day out of this, they said, "Stay there." Um, and so I always had support from national editorial leaders for covering this story. Less so among some of my colleagues that I would see every day who said, "You still at that thing? They're all guilty, aren't they? Why are you doing this?" Questions like that. But thankfully, I didn't take direction from people who had made up their minds that all cops are bastards, or that they have to be guilty, don't they? I dealt with senior editorial leaders in Toronto who understood that this was what was happening was really worthwhile, valuable to cover, no matter how it turned out. Um, And I think as a result of the coverage that I was doing, I think that's the reason why I ended up talking to Monty all those years ago, because he read my stuff and he said, of all the people that have been writing about this, not everything you write is flattering, but at least it's fair.
I
And
agree. I agree with I read your stuff over the years, and you did a terrific job. Like you had the insights from the beginning, and the courage of your convictions to tell the story, objectively.
Well, thank you. It's a major failing of the mainstream, well, all media, but mainstream, is that it's a mile wide and an inch deep. With criminal trials or courts, you show up on the first day and you show up on the last day when the decision is rendered, and you stenographically report it, and maybe you ask this side what they think and that side what they think. And that's what everybody did in this case. But when you sit through it every single day, you hear what the judge hears on a daily basis, and it makes it a lot more, a lot clearer what was going on in the judge's head, what they considered, and why the decision ultimately ends up being interesting, boring, it's absurd, and if I hadn't been there every single day of these criminal trials, I don't think I'd be able to offer that kind of an opinion. But having done it, I can tell you that this is it's just truly bizarre.
Well, Curt, that's a great that's great coverage. I think our audience is going to be really interested. I
There
could
you are. Here
I
you
could
are. You
listen for a
get
long
it.
time. Yeah, so I want to
There's the
encourage
doc.
people to look for Blamed and Broken. You can find it on Amazon, Indigo, and good local bookstores everywhere. So look for that and follow Curt's blog too. You update that regularly, Curt, so that's great for people. And yeah, we'll be looking forward to hearing more news in November next month, and
Yeah,
maybe get you back on to talk about it, depending on what emerges.
happy to do it.
Okay, that's great. Thank you very much again,
Thank you.
Curt, and we'll hope to see you
It's
again in
great.
the near future.
Great to have you, and thanks for taking the time.
Thanks for inviting me.
So, so we'll all right.
So there you are.
Yeah, that's isn't that something now? What an in-depth like anyway, I'll have to I have to everybody should be reading that book because I'm really curious about the trial strategies and the decision of the Crown, especially to divide that into four, and why the defense didn't fight it. Maybe two of them probably thought maybe correctly that they were going to get off and get a better deal on their own, but anyway, I'll have to find out in the book.
It's well, the sad thing is, as Curt says at the end, you got so many media who just basically buy the official narrative, and the public itself, they have an image of this narrative, and they don't really challenge the story. I mean, and we're seeing a pattern of this kind of conduct right across Canada for a number of years. That the stories you think you don't really know,
Well,
and the media has failed, and the public has failed itself, in not pushing for clear sort of answers.
Well, so that's good for us then, Paul. Really interesting night there. What a great guest. Thanks for arranging that, and I know the audience will appreciate it. And yeah, other than Go Jays, anything else you got ahead looking ahead to this week?
Well, the one thing I'm looking at right now, there was a shooting of a woman carrying a knife in Eastern Passage outside of Halifax by a Mountie the other day. And once again, we have no name for the victim in public and no name for the police officer involved. Out of privacy concerns, there cannot be privacy concerns when a police officer shoots someone, no matter what reason. We have to know who that person is and what their history is, because have they done it before? We have to know about that. It's something in the public interest, and I'm going to push this week to find out more about that shooting.
Yeah, there's that. In kind of an interesting legal case this week, Dr. Chris Milburn and some people from the Nova Scotia Civil Liberties have gotten public interest standing to challenge the centralized health information requirements from the provincial government. So we'll see how that unfolds in the coming months. Okay,
There's
that's great,
tons going on. I know that.
isn't
So
there? Yeah, there's lots to cover and always more stories than we can get to, but I think we covered some interesting ones tonight, and we'll be back next week with more. And so just leaves me to say thanks, Paul, and thanks
thank
everybody
you.
for watching, and thanks for listening, and we'll see you next week.